Thanks for being here. It's hopefully my tongue is gonna start rolling. It's been only the third conference, as I was saying, after a year and a half, and you guys look much taller in real life than in Zoom. But anyway, today my name is Gabriele Columbro. I'm the Executive Director of Finos. We are the Fintech Open Source Foundation, the financial services focused foundation under the Linux Foundation. You might notice that the title is slightly different than what we had on the schedule. And the reality is that as I was preparing the presentation, like this morning, no, I mean, in the last few days, this article came out from Andreessen Horowitz. Angela Strange, his general partner, Andreessen Horowitz, and she put out a really interesting article around, how open source is going to be driving the sort of next wave of innovation in financial services and in fintech, which, it's awfully similar to what we've been trying to say in the last 3 years that we've been driving Finos. And so, I thought this rose to the, importance that would make me change the title of the talk and be focused really on how we think open source is really revolutionizing, from our perspective, banks, and more sort of bringing together the sort of traditional world of financial institutions with the world of fintech. And again, open source being that bridge that is bringing these two worlds together. As I said, we are the Fintech Open Source Foundation. We were created about 3 years ago to bring together the industry, an industry that has been historically conservative and highly competitive through open source collaboration. I personally come from the open source communities. I'm an Apache committer. They don't allow me to touch code anymore, but I certainly have experienced the power of open source across different industries. And so, when we set out on this mission a few years ago, we started with about 15 members, about 3 projects. 3 years later, we have over 50 members, about 50 projects. And apart from bragging about the logo slide, which I always like to do that, what I really like about the community is that not only we have, of course, financial institutions, but we have brought more and more fintech vendors to the fold. And on the bottom right, this is a relatively new evolution, but one that I think is very powerful. We've brought industry consortia to the table. There's a lot of this, maybe more open standards focused, or just even sort of trade association type. Wall Street is full. I don't know how many of you work in the industry, but that industry is full of these trade associations. And oftentimes they lack of sort of concreteness. The output is a document or is a spec that struggles to be adopted and creates sort of fragmentation in the industry. And so I'm really excited for the next few years to have consortia joining our foundation, using us as a platform to actually create code around their standards that can get into the hands of the developers and really foster adoption. That's what I've seen in the past. If you're interested, again, if you're familiar with the Linux Foundation, we use a construct called Landscape. So if you go to landscape.finos.org, you'll find the 50 open source projects, open standard projects, and special interest groups that we host in Finos. And again, the last 2 years, I'm gonna walk you through how we got here, but it's important to understand that over the last 2 years, we've had a massive growth in terms of contributors. We have over 1,000 contributors. Of course, members are important, but we are not measured in, we're a nonprofit, so we're not measured in, the revenue that we bring in. We're measured into the adoption of the projects that actually solve concrete business problems in the industry. And there's so much technology that is specific to financial services that really 3 years ago, we thought there was a huge opportunity there. And this is sort of panning to be true, or showing to sort of coming to reality. I'd love to take all the credit for all this growth, but it's important to remember that last year, the whole industry, like many other industries, went through a, digital acceleration. 2 years ago, I couldn't even be on Zoom with a bank. They forced me to be on WebEx. Again, not trying to start a conferencing tool war here. But by mid last year, they were like, wow, dude, really? You're still on WebEx? I was like, banks all became hipsters all of a sudden. But yeah, so that also definitely played into it. Now, let me take you down a trip down memory lane. It always hasn't always been the case. Again, if you're familiar with the industry, you know how highly competitive the industry is, and just generally how culturally siloed the industry is, especially when you're talking about the big financial institutions, both in Europe, both in Wall Street, but also in Europe. As you can hear, I'm from the Silicon Valley, but I'm from that Italian part of the Silicon Valley, I guess. As you can probably hear from my accent. Even European financial institutions are very conservative, very legally driven, and so pretty much across the board. So this article is actually from only 8 years ago, maybe 9 years ago. So that was the sentiment, a few years ago. But banks, they certainly didn't have a positive outlook on open source. Best case, worst case, they hated open source. They considered it to be a risk. This is a pretty famous case. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was in 2011. Goldman Sachs sued one of their former developers that moved, again, allegedly moved code from their high-frequency trading platform to a public subversion repository. The defense, of course, was that was mostly open source code anyway, and there shouldn't be any sort of infringement there. Now, this has been a long story, very much talked about in the industry, especially in investment banking. But again, just tells you how much the perception of open source, even 5 to 10 years ago, was not a positive one. Was not seen like we are probably used in other industries as a way to accelerate progress, reduce costs, and be more efficient in general. But then something middle of the last decade sort of started to change. And I think this is a pretty spot on example. Again, I keep bringing up Goldman Sachs, of course, is one of our platinum members. Hopefully I don't get in trouble for that. But I don't know how many of you are familiar with a piece of technology that is used inside Goldman Sachs called SecDB. It's basically their securities database. It's used across the whole firm. It's used to interact with their customers. It has been widely regarded as their secret sauce, to the point that in 2013, this publication called it their secret sauce. Now, turns out that SecDB is based on a language called Slang, which is an internal language that was developed at Goldman Sachs, I think through an acquisition, actually. And so you fast forward only 4 years, the very same publication talks about the very same piece of software, SecDB, as potentially a weakness, probably one of the potential strategic weaknesses moving forward for Goldman Sachs. Why? Well, because they're struggling to find talent to actually maintain, develop, and evolve that platform. Especially if you compare it with some of their competitors who instead, ran their single dealer platforms, the platform that they offer to their customers to buy and trade on, open source frameworks and languages like Python. And so on one hand, there's a company that, had a competitive advantage, but is not able to sort of evolve and continue growing that platform and sort of retaining that competitive advantage. On the other side, you have someone who's built on an open source ecosystem that is very lively, that keeps adding every day new modules around AI, ML, things that are very, pandas. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a lot of these sort of machine learning libraries, but it's a very lively ecosystem. And so by the means of just choosing an open source language and ecosystem, their competitors were actually catching up without having to really spend anything on that. And so it's interesting to see how the perception of the industry started changing by middle of the last decade. Of course, this is an industry that has always consumed open source. I mean, I gotta say, many of my bank members 5 or 6 years ago, they were like, no, we don't do open source. And I'm like, yeah, sure. Like, developers find a way. Even if you have a very strict compliance policy, if there is a best of breed open source tool, especially with a license, that is commercially friendly, it's going to get in there one way or another. But definitely we didn't have examples of contribution from banks until a few years ago. And so by middle of the decade, we start seeing examples like AMQP was open sourced by JP Morgan with the help of Red Hat. OpenMama, hosted under the Linux Foundation, again, a messaging, I would say, harmonization platform that was supposed to, take feeds from the different exchanges and sort of map them in a common model and common APIs. We even have the first attempt to a foundation up here. The name is not really clear. It's called Lodestone. It was HSBC and Deutsche Bank tried to create a set of commons for their sort of trading technology. Again, unfortunately, the foundation wasn't really created with the right sort of 501c6 and right governance, and so it didn't go that far. But you can see how they're starting to realize that, open source is also a powerful way to disrupt the incumbents. This is an industry that is very much still, and I'm not talking incumbent banks, I'm talking incumbent vendors. Think about, the Bloombergs of the world. Think about the Thomson Reuters of the world. It's big vendors, which, open source actually create a really good playing field to commoditize certain features that are provided by these folks. And then finally, the Symphony Software Foundation is actually the predecessor of Finos. I got called to run it in 2015. It was really an endeavor between most of our Platinum members, who are currently our Platinum members, to create an open source ecosystem called Symphony that will provide chat and collaboration platform, again, for regulated industries. Chat is, in fact, just to put it in context, the most common way that traders talk to each other across the firewall. And you can imagine how many regulations apply to that in terms of, price fixing and all the scandals that there has been in the past. So this was a truly, again, interesting effort. Of course, when they called me in 2015 and they were like, banks want to go to cloud. I was like, yeah. And they want to do it open source. Yeah, sure. Turns out it was actually true. They were serious about it, and the rest is history. And so, before I go to sort of more concretely, sort of what are we seeing right now, and what are the trends and the projects that we're working on, I just want to kind of put it in context. Why has the industry actually looked at open source after decades of considering it really a risk, a liability? I think there are fundamentally 3 reasons. One, it's as simple as the industry doesn't have, that infinite amount of money any longer. After 2008, after the credit crunch, there's simply not, that infinite amount of money to throw at any technology problem that they had to face in the past. That was really always the approach. There's so much money, so much budget that, I'm just going to build it myself. Just to give you an example, from 2008 to 2021, I think it's $32 billion. Like the overall trading revenue has declined $32 billion, which is almost like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs disappeared in the last 10 years. On the flip side, the cost of regulation after 2008, the credit crunch, Dodd-Frank, MiFID regulations, again, I don't know how much are you familiar with those financial services regulation, but it grew over 30–40%. And so simply the margins are not there anymore to keep throwing money at the problem. That's, I think, the first fundamental sort of seismic shift that we've seen. The second item is really an industry that has evolved drastically in terms of the technology players that take part to it. Think about, of course, the fintech movement. We have, fintechs popping up as mushrooms over the last 10 years. There's been investments from the East Coast, from the West Coast, in Europe, in London. We have probably the most lively sort of VC-backed sort of fintech ecosystem. Push it even further, blockchain and decentralized technologies, like really threatening the very definition of what it means to be a bank, what it means to be a financial institution. And so whilst, until a couple of years ago, I couldn't even say blockchain, I should say, DLT, distributed ledger technology, thank you, or even the B word sometimes, this industry had to look into, drastically innovating from a technology standpoint, simply not to be run out of business. And that's, I think, again, partially a commercial reason, and partially it drove a cultural shift where, there is a cross-pollination between the two different sort of sides of the industry. And that's one item that I've really played a lot in trying to bring together through open source. And then finally, the sort of hate and love relationship between the East Coast and the West Coast. I mean, if you just Google, you'll find probably 20, 30 bank CIOs or CEOs that want to say, we are a technology company, or we want to be a technology company. And indeed, banks are largely technology centric, especially investment banking. It's all digital. There's literally no physical good being moved. But of course, there is, again, this hate and love with the East Coast and West Coast. Like, they, on one hand, there is this sort of grievance with big tech and the West Coast sort of eating their lunch and being non-regulated entities, but, having a much faster pace of delivering new technology. Well, on the other hand, they keep hiring executives out of Amazon, Google, Facebook, IBM. And so indeed, there is, once again, this sort of cultural cross-pollination that is happening. And yeah, you're seeing some of the leaders in the industry becoming more akin to technology companies, of course, with a sort of specific restriction and sort of frictions that being a regulated, highly compliant, still highly bureaucratic and centralized industry brings in. But I think this is really sort of the third sort of major driver that has been, driving this change. And so in 2018, going back to our history, we decided to expand the Symphony Software Foundation into Finos. Now, let alone it's not a platform, it's a foundation, but this is Forbes, so we'll take it. But we thought the time was right to really, also seeing the successes that the Linux Foundation and other foundations out there had in creating also corporate-backed open source foundations. We launched Finos, and we think the timing was pretty right. In just 3 years, we have grown to, as I said, over 50 projects, about 50 members. I'm not going to go through the whole history here. I don't want to make it too much of a pitch. But I think one point is pretty fundamental here. Early in the days, we've seen two trends. One, collaboration on open standards first. The industry wasn't ready yet to actually have developers contributing to open source both from a technology standpoint, even plainly legal and compliance. Like a developer at JP Morgan, well, a developer at one of my platinum banks, not JP Morgan, didn't have access to GitHub in 2017. Actually, they had get access, but not post. So they could read code, they could never, commit or send a pull request. Just to give you an example, it's almost like when I was a open source consultant 15 years ago, and I would go to customer and they were like, no, we don't have access to Google. And I'm like, what am I going to do? Like, without accessing mailing lists or, documentation websites, I was completely lost. So that was the first trend. And so they started collaborating on standards first, something that they're more familiar with, working groups and all sort of the gymnastics of running standards. And the second point, of course, code mostly came from vendors who are more, tech vendors, both fintech and just, technology vendors. 2020 really turned the table. In 2020, we've had contributions from net new projects, years and years of intellectual property contributed by JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Citi, and Deutsche Bank. Those are the sort of 5 top contributors in our foundation. And again, as much as, of course, we invested a lot in open source readiness, I'll talk to you about it, a little bit about the groups that we have and how we're helping and enabling the industry. The pandemic also gave a pretty strong acceleration to, it kind of played into our hand. Hey, now you all have to adapt in a month to work completely distributedly and run your trading floors from all over the world. Guess what? We've been doing this for 20 years in open source communities. So there's something more that you can learn from us and see, your business is not going down by your developers sending code across the wire from a remote location. And so that certainly played into it. To the point that this year, that's probably the slide that I'm the most proud of, consider where we came from. 7 out of 7, these are the top contributors. If you go to, our Linux Foundation metrics platform, lfx.linuxfoundation.org, 7 of the top contributors are actually from banks, from 4 different institutions. This is literally our leaderboard in this order. Now, someone might argue contributions is not just about code. I mean, I've been telling them that mantra for 15 years, and it's true. Documentation, emails, events. There's so many ways to contribute. But when you're trying to grow a community from scratch, there's nothing like code to really build a not only concrete community that is sort of above and beyond what you can do with an open standard, or that really complements really well with an open standard, but also that ultimately delivers value quickly to the adopters. They can just take the software, install it, run it, and so on and so forth. So a couple of examples of projects that we're working on, just to put it in context. This is probably our biggest project. It's called Legend, not just because I had dreadlocks and, I love Bob Marley. Actually, this is the data modeling platform that Goldman Sachs has been using for 20 years across their whole industry, their whole organization. It's used for risk modeling, for regulatory reporting, for price modeling. It's really a very powerful visual collaborative platform that does, by the way, integrate with GitLab. So the output, the database, the models that you collaborate on are actually stored in an open source repository that is, SDLC and, leverages the whole merge request workflow to really allow collaborative editing. 2 points I want to make here. Again, this has been contributed last year. We have seen adoption. We have seen contribution from other banks. Actually, it's going to be integrated. We're going to be announcing in a couple of weeks integration with another piece of software that is in the foundation from another bank, which again, hopefully is the next step of our maturity, individual contributions, and then sort of cross-pollinating and creating joint components that are of added value. But one interesting aspect here is we are also hosting the Legend platform in our environment. And we have invited business folks, not necessarily developers, since this is a visual modeling platform, we have been able to really shortcut and, go to the business and say, hey, you have a problem in the way data is represented across the industry when you are, reporting to regulators, or when you are collaborating with, the buy side, so the wealth management and funds. How about you come and collaborate using open source methodologies, but through a visual platform that doesn't require you to, have to code. And we have seen a huge uptake of that element of collaboration. So I think sort of the bottom line here is, I'm not going to say that the industry is on par yet with the tech industry as to sort of how you collaborate in the open, but we're trying to create primitives to enable different groups of people, not just your sort of technology organization, to get value out of the open source collaboration mode. And I think that's going to be, one of the most sort of powerful ways that I think open source is here to stay as far as banks collaboration goes. Another example is our FCP3 standard. That's more of a, your typical open standard. Is about, I don't know if you guys are familiar with those, with traders working on a trading floor with 7 screens and 27,000 applications on their desktop. Well, this is a standard that allows those applications to interoperate with each other. So it provides an API, it provides, a standardization of the context that gets passed across application. It defines a standard for an app directory, so basically an app store that you can go and sort of pick and choose your applications. Again, this is very specific, like most of the projects that we do, it's very specific to the industry. But I think what I'm happy to show here is that we have all these nice logos out there. And I'm not sure if, you realize how hard it is to get the logo of a bank on a slide. These are actually folks that have said, yes, we are adopting the standard. Yes, we are participating to the standard. Yes, you can use our logo. And, I'm not a vendor, so I didn't have to give them a discount or anything like that to be able to quote them. But they're typically press shy. And so again, I think also from a cultural standpoint, this shows a really powerful evolution that is happening. Now, we talked about all the cool stuff that is happening. Let's ground it a little bit in numbers. We certainly have seen really nice qualitative trends over the last few years, but as we now enter really new phase of our foundation, I really needed a baseline, quantitative baseline, as to where indeed is the industry in this open source journey. And so we released earlier this week the state of open source in financial services. It's freely available. There's actually even an open data set. I would love for anyone to play around with it and pull out some different sort of slicing and dicing of the numbers. We did it in collaboration with the Linux Foundation Research, Wipro, GitHub, and Scott Logic. And I want to share with you just a couple of highlights that you might find sort of interesting. Again, let's start with the good news. 2 years ago, I used to say, the financial services industry is probably 10, 15 years behind in the understanding and adoption of open source compared to other industries. I mean, basically, I found myself having the same conversations 2 years ago in this industry that I used to have, just with a tech company 15 years ago. Just open source is evil or that kind of stuff. I think, again, over the last 2 years, we've seen a drastic acceleration, and the data seems to prove it. Over, 84% of our respondents, considers innovation, open source as a key driver for innovation. Not only that, but, reduce time to market, reduce total cost of ownership, talent retention. So these are all, I think, coming from the open source communities, these are all again, at least from a corporate standpoint, these are really sort of the fundamental reasons why a corporate invests in open source collaboration. And so I would say, the industry at strategic level is getting, on par in terms of understanding why they should be doing open source. Let's push it a little bit further. They're looking finally at contributing to Upstream. And that is, again, something that like even the definition of Upstream wasn't very clear 2 or 3 years ago. Now, of course, this is an industry that has, likes to consider itself like a special snowflake. And to a certain extent, they do have, again, regulatory restrictions do impose particular constraints, particular sort of just cultural risk-averse environment. But the idea that it's not just about throwing money at a foundation, or it's not just about, saying that you're doing open source. And the goal is not just to, sort of dump code out there, but it's really to influence how the building blocks of the internet are created, Kubernetes, Linux. This is actually one of the reasons why I decided to merge into the Linux Foundation, to provide, that sort of consolidated view of financial services requirements to also upstream projects. So I guess the strategic drivers are right. Fortunately, only 8% of our respondents have an actual policy that allows or encourages even upstream contributions. And that's still much lower than what you see in other industries. So there's still a long way to go. I mean, great. 65% of companies have a consumption policy. That's great. That's much more than I thought it would be. But only 35% have an OSPO. And if we're talking about, I think my JP Morgan board member has 60,000 developers under him. I'm still wondering, what do you do with 60,000 developers? But anyway, that's a different conversation. You need an OSPO. You need a centralized, properly represented program management office that allows you to keep sanity in your open source contributions. And the main finding that we've had in terms of why the industry still has a long way to go was really about lack of sort of seniority in the open source leadership. It's still, I'm not going to say, a pet project. It's more than that, but there has been consistently a lack of, strategic level, C-level, C-suite mandates to do open source. And that's where we think, sort of the next frontier of our job is. And that's why we continue to work in what we call our open source readiness program. This has played definitely for our members a key role into enabling them to actually contribute to open source. We have a reference open source policy that was open sourced by one of our banks that other folks can consume. We have a license compliance handbook. We just did, the survey that report that you saw before. A maturity model is coming up soon. Now, arguably, probably 60% of what this group does is no different than, more broad initiatives like, I don't know if you're familiar with the To-Do group in the Linux Foundation or other really just open source enablement organizations. But we still find every day that there are specific items to a regulated industry that are very well addressed by a dedicated venue. It's much more powerful than, when, say, the Goldman Sachs lawyer tells the JP Morgan lawyer how they have solved a certain problem, than an Italian guy try to sell them into it. And so I'm going to try to wrap. What we really are trying to do, and that's one of the main goals, we think the technology organization within this organization gets it. Your talent retention, your increased efficiency, de-risking, preventing vendor lock-in. I think those are all items and reasons that are clear now to financial services tech, sort of the IT departments within financial service organizations. We are seeing, as I said before, with Legend, open source going beyond code and involving more and more business folks into using, patterns, ways and patterns of open source collaboration, to better collaborate with your customers, to better collaborate with regulators, and just to, again, share common industry challenges. I mean, these institutions need to collaborate by nature. They exchange money, they trade every day with each other. So there is an inherent benefit to all of them. If they were all using, I don't know, the same standard to represent the security, why not the same SDK or the same API? And, of course, we have projects that hit on each of these levels, but where we're still sort of just seeing a glimpse of it is really like what we see in the technology industry, using open source to drive your, strategic goals. Of course, while never forgetting that open source is made out of individuals, and you really need to find the right balance between it's really hard to find the right balance between sort of your corporate strategy and your sort of the individual nature that motivates open source communities. But that's where we're only seeing a few of the organizations really starting to take strategic leaps to, I don't know, commoditize a competitor or, really standardize a certain ecosystem. So that's our sort of next big thing. I'll skip on the ROI. One of the ways, and I'll close on this one because it's one that is very close to my heart. One of the areas where we think there is a huge potential for really everyone involved, banks, fintechs, individuals, downstream users of the financial system, and regulators themselves, is what we call our Open Racktech initiative. If you think about open source collaboration, again, in a corporate world, it's typically on areas that are non-competitive, areas where, there's common requirements across a group of companies, where there is a potential for cost saving. If you think about those three requirements, regulatory implementation really strikes all the boxes. All banks have to comply with it. It's a huge item on their bottom line. It's non-competitive. They have to all comply with it. It's just a cost. So that's our first focus for this initiative. We have a SIG. We are starting to engage with regulators. The long-term goal, probably when my grandkids grow up, is that actually regulators would start writing regulations in a machine-readable format, open source machine-readable format. And there are, again, I'm being a little bit too pessimistic here, or maybe hedging my bets, but there are really interesting efforts there in the UK with the FCA, in the US with the CFPB, FDIC are the most sort of tech-savvy, open source-friendly regulators. So this is, once again, for us from the Finos standpoint, is really a shortcut to become even more indispensable to the industry and sort of rise to that strategic level that I was touching on before. In conclusion, I talked a lot about, the corporate reasons why open source is hopefully gonna drive innovation in financial services. But again, let's not forget that communities are actually made of individuals. And, I myself wouldn't be here if I hadn't started, contributing to open source when I was a kid. And there is a huge supply, like the demand from the industry is experiencing a huge talent crunch. Folks want to work for tech companies. They don't want to work for banks anymore. So there is a huge demand in the industry with, pretty high packages and salaries that get paid for working in the industry. So I think open source has really the potential to make that industry more appealing to a huge crowd of open source folks, and really drive the next wave of innovation there. And so, you know, whether you are financial institutions, a fintech, a regulator, or an individual, you know, we think there are, you know, substantial benefits. It is my belief that, you know, open source will make this ecosystem more efficient and more sort of a level playing field. And ultimately, us as consumers and average users of the financial system can have a better, you know, user experience, more financial inclusion, you know, a more sort of fair usage of the resources that actually these folks have. And oh, I forgot one slide. If you happen to be in New York in 3 weeks, we're back in person as well, our Open Source Strategy Forum. We've been craving to see the community back in person, so we'd love to have you there. There's something to build communities in person, and I really want to thank you for being here and you know, taking the chance to be back in person. Thank you so much.